The Last Spring, Part 1, The Sound of What's Missing. She had $10, which was more than nothing, which was, if she was being honest with herself at all, barely more than nothing. The $10 had come from Mrs. Alderman on Chestnut Street, who had a mantel clock with a worn-out mainspring and a granddaughter's wedding coming up in April, and was very specific about needing both problems resolved before the end of the month. Wren had resolved the clock problem in 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, bent over the kitchen table at the Hollander's house with her loop pressed to her eye and Nora's smallest screwdrivers laid out in order of size on a piece of clean flannel. Mrs. Alderman had paid her $10 in cash and folded the bills with the care of someone who understood that small sums required precise handling. She had thanked Wren and shown her to the door and said to send her grandmother's love. Wren hadn't corrected her. Nora had been gone for 2 years. Some losses you stopped explaining. You just carried them the way you carried a watch you couldn't bring yourself to wind, because winding it meant admitting you were the only one left to do it. The 4 days since she'd left the Hollander's house had been cold, not dramatically cold, not the cold of survival movies and disaster stories, just the persistent settling cold of Western Massachusetts in early March, which didn't so much hit you as move into your clothes and stay there, the way certain kinds of grief moved into a person and declined to leave regardless of what was happening on the outside. She had her canvas messenger bag. She had Nora's loop on a leather cord around her neck. She had the set of watch screwdrivers in the inner pocket of her jacket, wrapped in the same piece of flannel she'd been using for 3 years. She had a photograph of Nora taken in 1974, sitting at a workbench with a pocket watch open in front of her and a look on her face that said she was listening to something no one else in the room could hear. She had the $10. She was sitting at the counter of a diner on Main Street in Turner's Falls, eating a bowl of soup slowly because soup was the most food she could get for the amount of money she currently had and because she needed to think. The 18 months between leaving the Hollanders and this particular diner counter had included 2 more addresses, 1 more town, and exactly 0 permanent arrangements. She'd slept on a cousin's couch in Northampton until the cousin's boyfriend objected. She'd rented a room above a laundromat in Greenfield until the landlord raised the rate past what clock repairs could cover. She'd learned across those 18 months that the difference between stable and unstable was not character. It was not effort. It was the size of the net underneath you when you fell. And she'd had no net, just her own hands, which were good hands, steady hands, hands that could hold a screwdriver perfectly still for 7 minutes while she adjusted an escapement 1/4 turn at a time. But good hands didn't pay first and last month's rent. Behind her, 2 men in a booth were talking about buildings. She wasn't listening on purpose, but her hearing was the way it was finely tuned in a way that Nora had called a gift and which felt on certain days more like a condition. She could not be in a room without registering everything in it. The refrigerator cycling on behind the counter, the cook's tongs clicking on the grill, the difference in pitch between the front door's hinge and the back door's hinge, the ceiling light at the far end of the room that was humming at slightly the wrong frequency and would need replacing within the month. The man in the booth behind her had a voice that carried without effort. Been on the town's surplus list since 2012, he said. Nobody wants it. Too small for a business. Too old to insure. Which one? Said the second man. Mill Street in Montague Center. Little clapboard place next to the old Grange Hall. Wainwright no Hartwell. Hartwell clocks. Been shut since '69. Something moved in her chest. Not recognition. Not quite memory. Something from before either of those, the feeling she'd had once at age 6, pressing her ear against the wooden case of a clock and hearing something she hadn't expected to find. She turned around. The man closest to her was in his 70s flannel shirt, wire-rimmed glasses. He looked surprised. People generally looked surprised when Wren turned around in diners and interjected. She had been working on this. "Excuse me," she said. "The shop on Mill Street, is it still standing?" He looked at her for a moment. "Last I heard, yeah. Why you interested?" "Yes," she said, which was the understatement of a very young life. She had grown up listening to the inside of clocks, not the outside sound, not the ticking that anyone could hear standing in a room. The inside sound, the small mechanical whisper of a mainspring unwinding through a gear train, the click of an escapement releasing one tooth at a time, the almost inaudible vibration of a balance wheel swinging back and forth at the frequency a clockmaker had calibrated it to. These were sounds most people never noticed, sounds that existed in the space between ordinary attention and true listening. Her grandmother had taught her to hear them the way other grandmothers taught their grandchildren to hear birdsong, or the way your own name sounds when someone who loves you says it across a quiet room. Nora Colby had been a watch and clock repair woman at a small jeweler's shop in Greenfield, Massachusetts for 33 years, not because she had planned it, because a man named Mr. Aldrin, who ran the shop and who had been looking for someone with a particular gift for most of his working life, had hired her at 19 to sweep floors and answer the telephone, and had discovered within her first month that the new shop girl could hear a watch running slow from across the room. He had tested her. 3 watches on the counter, 1 running correctly, 1 running 2 seconds fast per day, 1 running 4 seconds slow. He asked her to identify the slow one. Nora had listened for about 10 seconds. Then she had pointed to the correct watch without hesitation. Mr. Aldrin had looked at her over the tops of his glasses. "You have the ear," he said. "I've been looking for someone with the ear for 20 years. He had trained her across the next 4 years. Everything he knew, how to disassemble a movement without losing the smallest parts, how to clean each component in benzene with a horsehair brush, how to inspect a mainspring for fatigue cracks that weren't yet visible but could be heard as a faint stuttering under the tick, how to adjust an escapement, how to calibrate a balance wheel, how to hear whether the regulation was exactly correct or off by a single quarter turn of the regulation screw. Nora had learned quickly. She could hear in the tick of a clock whether the escapement was balanced, whether one side of the swing was fractionally longer than the other. Most repairers needed a timing machine to detect a 2-second per day variance. Nora could hear it with her ear pressed to the case. Mr. Aldrin had called it the finest pitch discrimination he had ever encountered in 60 years of the trade. He had retired in the mid-60s, sold the shop to Nora for $1. The price of the inventory, he said, was the 30 years she was going to spend taking care of it. Nora had run the shop until her arthritis made the fine work impossible. She had been the last working watch repair woman in Franklin County. She had repaired, by her own careful count, somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 watches and clocks across her career. The mantle clocks and grandfather clocks and pocket watches and wristwatches of every family in the valley brought to her bench in a steady procession across 3 decades. Nora had also kept on her wrist every working day the Fessenden watch, a 1920s Hamilton railroad-grade pocket watch that Mr. Aldrin had carried every day of his working life and had given to Nora on the day he retired. He had told her to keep it wound. "The day this watch stops, the shop stops," he had said. Nora had wound it every morning at 7:15 for 33 years. She had wound it on the last morning of her life. Nora had also told Wren across 12 years of Saturday visits about the old clockmaker shops of the valley. There had been 7 in Franklin County at the peak of the trade. By the time Nora started in 1961, 2 were left. By 1969, none. The last to close had been on Mill Street in a town called Millhaven, run by a man named Ezra Hartwell, who was, according to Nora, the last person in the valley who could build a clock from raw brass and steel rather than simply repair one. She had asked whether the shop was still standing. Nora had said, "As far as I know, nobody's been inside since he locked the door." She had said it in the particular tone she used when something had been filed away for later, the tone of a woman who knew how to wait. Wren had grown up in foster care from the age of 6. Her father, Thomas, had been an alcoholic who lost custody, along with most other things he had ever been given. Her mother, Diane, had left Greenfield when Wren was 2 and had not come back. She had been placed with a couple named the Hollanders, Carl and Beth, who were decent in the limited way that certain foster parents were decent. They fed her, clothed her, drove her to school. They did not love her the way they loved their own 3 children, and Wren had understood the arithmetic of this at 6 years old without being told. Biological children first, foster child second until further notice. She had learned to occupy less space than she needed, to need less attention than she wanted, to make herself small enough that the household could accommodate her without too much inconvenience. The fixed point had been Nora. Every Saturday from the age of 6 until the age of 18, 2 miles from the Hollanders' house on Federal Street to Nora's house on Elm Street, 2 miles in rain, 2 miles in snow, 2 miles in the heavy August heat of the Pioneer Valley that smelled of the river and was a different species of heat than anywhere else. Nora had taught her the first lesson on the first Saturday. She set a small mantel clock on the kitchen bench and said, "Put your ear against the case and tell me what you hear." Wren pressed her ear to the wood. "Ticking," she said. "Listen harder. Listen past the ticking. The ticking is the outside of the clock. I want you to hear the inside." Wren had listened. She heard underneath the ticking a quieter sound, a small rhythmic whisper. Click and release, click and release, steady and precise and very slightly different on each side. "That's the escapement," Nora said. "That's the heartbeat. If the heartbeat is even, the clock keeps time. If it limps, if one side of the swing is longer than the other, the clock drifts. Can you hear it limping?" Wren listened for a long time. "No, it sounds even." "Good, because it is even. This clock is healthy." Nora brought out a second clock. "Now try this one." Wren pressed her ear to the second case. The difference was immediate. The click on one side was fractionally louder than the click on the other, a tiny asymmetry that she could hear at 6 years old but could not yet describe. "That one's limping," Wren said. Nora looked at her in a way that was not surprise but the recognition of something expected. "You have the ear," she said. It was the same sentence Mr. Aldrin had said to her 45 years earlier. In this kitchen between these 2 women, it passed again. Wren did not understand at 6 what it meant. By 10, she understood completely. By 12, Nora had let her do her first full repair, a mainspring replacement in a small carriage clock belonging to a retired professor from Deerfield Academy. The professor picked it up the following Saturday and held it to his ear for a long moment. "It sounds different," he said. "It sounds younger." Nora said, "My granddaughter did the work." He looked at Wren on her wooden stool, this thin girl with dark hair and serious eyes who barely took up the space she was given. He said, "Then I'm going to bring you my grandfather clock next month." He had. Wren repaired it. By 16, she was doing most of the work herself, because Nora's arthritis had progressed to the point where she could no longer hold the small screwdrivers and tweezers required for watch repair. Nora sat beside her and described what to do. Wren's hands did the work Nora's hands could no longer do. The arrangement had been for both of them the most natural thing in the world. Nora's knowledge lived in her ears and her memory. Wren's skill lived in her hands. Between them, they were one complete repair woman. The clients had accepted the transition as though it had always been planned. Mrs. Alderman from Shelburne Falls brought her grandmother's Seth Thomas every January and said, "Your hands are steadier than Dorothea's ever were." Nora, sitting right there, said every year, "That's true." Mr. Petrowski from Turner's Falls brought his father's railroad pocket watch every March and stood at the bench and watched Wren work and never said anything except, at the end, "My father would have allowed this." By 17, Wren had understood that the work was not just mechanical. The work was custodial. She was not simply repairing clocks. She was maintaining the relationship between a family and its history. A clock that had been in a household for 3 generations was not a machine. It was a member of the household. The women who brought their clocks to Nora's kitchen bench were not asking for a repair. They were asking for a promise. The promise that the clock would continue to keep time for the next generation the way it had kept time for the last. Wren had made that promise silently, with every mainspring she wound and every escapement she balanced. And the making of that promise had been the closest thing to a vocation she had ever found. Nora had died when Wren was 18, a heart attack at home, at the kitchen bench, on a Saturday morning in October, which was the only day it could have happened. She had been holding a pocket watch, a client's piece, a 1940s Elgin that a woman in Greenfield had brought in 3 days earlier because the balance staff was worn. She had set it down carefully on the bench mat before she died, which was exactly the kind of thing Nora would do, because a watch set down carelessly could be damaged, and Nora did not damage watches, not even in the last 10 seconds of her life. Wren had taken the loop, the set of screwdrivers, the wooden stool, the photograph of Nora at the shop bench in 1974, the small tin of watch oil Nora had kept on the kitchen shelf for 30 years, and the Fessenden watch, the Hamilton Railroad pocket watch that Mr. Aldrin had carried every day of his working life and given to Nora, and that Nora had wound every morning for 33 years, and that Wren had wound every morning since. The Hollanders had not wanted any of these things. The Hollanders had ended 6 months after Nora's death, when their biological daughter came home from college and needed her room back. Beth Hollander had told Wren on a Wednesday evening, with the tone of someone who felt a certain formality was owed but was not apologizing. "It's Jessica's room," Beth had said. "It was always Jessica's room. I'm sorry, Ada." Wren had understood. She had been second for 12 years. She had always known that second ended when first came back. She had packed her messenger bag in 40 minutes, walked out of the Hollanders' house on a cold October morning and not looked back, because looking back made it harder, and she had learned very early that some things were easier if you kept facing forward and let the distance grow on its own. The 18 months after that had been difficult in the unglamorous, unseasonable, grindingly ordinary way that difficult could be. She had found 2 temporary arrangements and lost both through circumstances that were not entirely her fault, which was its own kind of lesson. She had repaired clocks wherever she was. She had kept Nora's tools. She had kept the loop around her neck and the screwdrivers in their flannel wrap, and the Fessenden watch wound every morning at 7:15, because the watch stopping had felt like a line she was not willing to cross. She had arrived eventually at this diner counter, at this bowl of soup, at $10 and 4 days since the last arrangement had ended, and the sense which she had developed very young of knowing when a situation had fully played itself out and it was time to look for the next one. The next one was apparently a clockmaker's shop on Mill Street in Mill Haven. She walked to the Mill Haven town clerk's office the next morning. 40 minutes. The Pioneer Valley in early March had that quality where the light was bright and the warmth was entirely withheld, like a window open to the sun with the heat turned off. The town clerk's office was in a small brick building on the main road. She pushed open the door. Mrs. Oster looked up. She was 65 years old with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had the expression of someone who had spent decades making order out of other people's disorder, and had developed a very accurate first impression of people who came through her door and what they were going to need. She looked at Wren for a moment. "You're here about the Mill Street property," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Wren said. "Hartwell Clocks." Mrs. Oster reached for a file. "The building has been on our surplus list since 2012. Before that, the Historical Commission maintained it until they ran out of budget. We've tried to transfer it 3 times through standard channels. No interest." "How much?" Mrs. Oster looked at her over her glasses. "The town would be satisfied with $10 and a commitment to maintain the structure." Wren put the $10 on the counter. Mrs. Oster looked at the bills, then at Wren. Then she stamped the deed with the deliberate, conclusive movements of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and did not rush the ceremonial parts. "One more thing," she said. She opened the top drawer of her desk and produced a key on a leather fob, heavy brass, worn smooth, clearly original to the building. It had been opening and closing since someone first made it. Ezra Hartwell locked his door in November of 1969 and walked this key to this office and set it on this counter. He said, "Hold this for whoever comes next. We have been holding it for 55 years. She set the key in front of Wren. A pause. "I met your grandmother once. She came here asking about this building years ago." Another pause. She seemed like a woman who knew how to wait for the right time. Wren's hand closed around the key. The leather fob was warm from the drawer. She didn't trust her voice, so she nodded once. Mrs. Oster nodded back, and that was enough. Mill Street was 2 blocks from the clerk's office. The building appeared in under 5 minutes. The clapboard front had buckled along the sill. The display window was boarded with plywood, weathered to gray. A sign hung above the door. The lettering faded to near illegibility. "Hartwell Clocks." She put the brass key in the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been doing this every day. One long room. Plank floor, plaster walls, pressed tin ceiling with a stamped floral pattern she could just make out through the dust, the kind of ceiling that took a craftsman a week to install and lasted a century. The room smelled of old wood and benzene residue, which was not a smell most people would recognize, but which Wren recognized immediately and completely. It was the smell of Nora's kitchen on a Saturday morning, the smell of work done carefully over many years. A workbench along the left wall, small drawers below it, each labeled in faded ink, empty shelves on the right, and against the back wall, floor to ceiling, a master regulator clock, tall mahogany case, glass door showing the movement, brass pendulum motionless, white enamel dial, Roman numerals, the kind of dial that had been designed to be read from across a room. The hand stood at 4:47, still, silent for 55 years. She crossed the room and opened the glass door. The movement was visible inside. Brass plates, gear train, escapement. The mainspring barrel was empty. Someone had deliberately removed the mainspring from this clock before locking the door, had taken the heart out of it. Without the spring, the clock is furniture. She didn't know yet where that thought had come from. She would understand soon. She ran her hand along the mahogany case. The wood was sound, dry but intact. The joints still tight. Whatever Ezra Hartwell had been, he had built or chosen this case for something that would last, and lasting had held. She moved around to the back. The mahogany back panel was held by 6 screws. She almost moved on. Almost. But she stopped, because her eye had caught something the way her ear usually caught things first. She leaned closer. 6 screws. New screws. Not just newer than the clock. Newer than the building. The screw heads were bright, barely oxidized, with no discoloration in the slots. The wood around each hole showed faint, circular compression marks from a modern driver bit. She pressed one screw lightly with her thumbnail. Snug, but not the deep permanence of a fastener that had been in the same place for 50 years. Someone had removed this panel recently, not decades ago, months ago, maybe less. She stood with her hands on the back of the clock. Someone had been in this building through means she didn't yet understand, since Mrs. Oster had held the key and had removed the back panel of this clock, and had put it back with new screws, because they hadn't found what they came for and had needed to leave the appearance of nothing having been disturbed. They had been looking for something and apparently had not found it. Okay. So, someone came here before you, someone with a screwdriver and no compunction and no ability to find what they came for. She picked up a flathead screwdriver from the workbench, backed out the 6 bright screws, set them in a row on the bench. The panel came free. Behind it, in a cavity between the clock case and the wall, approximately 12 inches deep, rough plaster at the back. Her hand found one by one a brass barrel, heavy and dense, a mainspring coiled inside its housing, a canvas pouch tied with a cord, a different kind of heavy, dense small objects, and a folded letter in an envelope with no stamps and no postmark, just a date in the upper left corner in small, precise handwriting. November 11th, 1969. She set the pouch on the bench. She opened the envelope. The paper was cream-colored, slightly brittle at the folds, but completely intact. The handwriting was the handwriting of someone who had spent a life working at small scale and wrote the way they worked deliberately, without excess, with every mark placed exactly where it was meant to be. To whoever finds this mainspring, my name is Ezra Hartwell. I have repaired and maintained the clocks of this valley from my father's bench since 1934 and from my own since 1952. Today is November 11th, 1969. I am closing this shop because the battery clock has made my trade unnecessary in the eyes of commerce, and I am a realistic enough man to know when a trade has been decided against. I am removing the mainspring from the master regulator because the spring is the clock. Without the spring, the clock is furniture. With the spring, it is alive. I am leaving it for the person who knows the difference, which is not the same as leaving it for the first person who opens this compartment. It is leaving it for the right one. There is one thing I must tell you about how I came to leave it as I did. My colleague, Mr. Aldrin of Greenfield, a watchmaker of 40 years standing, with whom I had corresponded since 1940, spoke to me many times across our friendship of a woman he had trained. Her name was Nora. He said she was the finest natural listener he had ever encountered. He said she could hear a 2-second timing error from across a room. He said she was the only person he had found in 60 years of this trade with what he called the ear. Mr. Aldrin believed the ear was not learned but inherited, a particular neurological gift that ran in families the way perfect pitch ran in some musical families, measurable, specific, and very rare. I believed him. So when I built the compartment behind this clock, I built it not with a visible latch or a mechanical release or anything that could be found by someone looking. I built it to be found by someone listening. The cavity is sealed along the left edge by a strip of lead weighted to dampen ambient vibration. When the clock is running, the sound of the pendulum passes through the case and creates a specific resonance in the lead strip, a small, steady hum that is audible only from one position, both palms flat against the back of the case, left ear turned toward the lower left corner, approximately 14 inches from the floor. From that position, the lead strip is audible, and the seam of the hidden panel is perceptible in the change in resonance against the surrounding wood. A person without the ear would not hear it. They would look at the back panel and see wood and screws and eventually leave. If you are reading this letter, you found the panel, which means either you have the ear or you knew someone who did. If you carry Nora's lineage, if that gift passed through to the next generation which I have always believed it would, then you are welcome here. The tools in the workbench are yours. The spring in the brass barrel is yours. The gold in the canvas pouch is yours to steward as you see fit. A clockmaker's shop without a clockmaker is a room full of silence. The silence is not empty. The silence is waiting. Wind the spring. Start the clock. Ezra Hartwell. Clockmaker, Millhaven, Massachusetts, November 11th, 1969. She read it twice. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the base of the master regulator and closed her eyes and listened to the silence of the room, the silence of a clockmaker's shop in which no clock was ticking, dense, patient, the silence of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned not to be impatient about it. Okay. Your grandmother's name is in this letter, written by a man who died before you were born, written by a man who knew Mr. Aldrin, who taught Nora, who taught you, and he built something and left it for the person who would be able to hear it. And you are sitting on the floor of the shop, and the letter is in your hand, and somewhere behind the wood of this clock, there is a lead strip that will hum if the clock is running, and you are 20 years old, and you have $10 in your jacket. And she stood up. She pressed both palms flat against the back of the case, left ear turned down and toward the lower left corner, approximately 14 inches from the floor. She listened. It took about 30 seconds. Then she heard it. A faint, steady hum at the very low edge of audibility. Not a sound exactly, more the suggestion of one. The lead strip resonating in the infinitesimal ambient vibration of the old building. An almost imperceptible change in the quality of the silence at the lower left of the panel where the seam of the hidden cavity ran. A different quality of empty. She pressed her thumbnail along the seam. The hidden panel shifted, a millimeter of give, cut to fit exactly and held only by that weighted lead strip along the edge. She pried gently with the flat head. The panel came free, thinner than the outer panel, lighter. Behind it, nothing additional. The gold and the mainspring were already on the bench. She had found them first. But she sat for a moment with the hidden panel in her hands and understood what had happened. Someone had come here with a screwdriver and had removed the outer panel with new screws, had stood in this room looking at the inside of the clock case and had found nothing. Because they had been looking, she had listened. Because that was what Nora had spent 12 years teaching her. The canvas pouch held coins, 41 of them, gold in the way gold was specifically heavy, dense, and self-certain in the palm. Liberty gold pieces, various sizes, various dates. She didn't know exactly what they were worth. She would find out. She set the pouch carefully beside the letter and picked up the mainspring barrel. A mainspring makes no sound in isolation. It is a coiled strip of tempered steel compressed into a brass barrel, storing energy the way a held breath stores air. It only has a voice when it is installed in its clock and allowed to unwind through the gear train, tick by tick. She examined the spring through the access hole in the barrel end, intact. No fatigue cracks at the inner coil, no corrosion. Whoever Ezra Hartwell had been, he had oiled this spring before sealing it, and the oil had kept faith across 55 winters. She found a mainspring winder in the second drawer, clock oils in the fourth drawer, stoppered with corks still viscous, a horsehair brush, a bench pin, a full set of clock screwdrivers arranged in a wooden rack by blade width, everything in its place, everything where it had spent decades waiting. She worked the way Nora had taught her. First, the gear train, each pivot cleaned with the horsehair brush and a cotton cloth from her bag, dry cleaning rather than benzene because she didn't have benzene yet, imperfect but sufficient for a first start. 2 drops of clock oil on each pivot, not more, because too much oil attracted dust and thickened and impeded movement. Nora had said this every time. 2 drops, no more. Then the escapement, the pallet faces, the lock and draw angle, the banking pins, The escapement was intact, the finest she had ever handled, the work of someone at the full height of his skill, built not for this year, but for the next century. Then the mainspring. She seated the barrel in the arbor, hooked the inner end of the spring to the winding post, engaged the click spring, wound the barrel 3 turns. She reached up and set the pendulum swinging. A single push, gentle. The pendulum swung left, the gear train engaged, the escapement ticked, then ticked again, then again. Then the room, which had been silent for 55 years, was no longer silent. The sound traveled through the plaster walls and the plank floor and the pressed tin ceiling and settled into the building the way warmth settled into a cold room when a fire was lit. Not just sound but presence, not just noise but the declaration that something here was alive again. She stepped to the center of the room. She listened. The tick was even, both sides of the swing equal, no limp, no asymmetry. The clock was healthy. After 55 years of motionlessness, the master regulator in the old Hartwell shop on Mill Street in Mill Haven was keeping time again. She stood in the empty room and listened to it. She thought about Mr. Aldrin, who had set 3 watches on a counter and found in a 19-year-old shop girl the ear he had been looking for 20 years. She thought about Nora, who had carried that gift and spent 33 years repairing the valley's clocks, and 12 more years transmitting everything she knew to a girl on a wooden stool who had needed more than anything the Hollanders could provide the experience of being necessary to something. She thought about Ezra Hartwell, who had sealed a spring inside a wall because he understood that a spring sealed in a wall would outlast a spring left in a clock that no one was winding, who had built a compartment that could only be opened by someone who had learned to listen before they learned to look. Nora had known about this shop, had come to ask Mrs. Oster about it, which meant, and this was the thing she couldn't quite hold still long enough to examine, yet the thing she needed more time with Nora had known this might be where Wren ended up, had prepared for it in the patient, indirect way Nora prepared for everything, like a clockmaker, oiling the pivots before the wear shows, setting the rate before the drift becomes a problem, winding the spring before the clock needs it. The shop had been silent for 55 years. The silence had not been empty. Wren Colby was 20 years old. She had $10 in her jacket pocket, 41 gold coins on a clockmaker's bench, and a letter in her hand from a man she had never met who had known her grandmother's name. She said quietly to the room, to the clock, to whoever might be listening from the other side of the silence, "I'll wind the spring, Mr. Hartwell." The clock ticked on, steady, even, unhurried, the way good things ran when they had been built correctly and kept by the right hands. Part 2X, Bright Screws. The coin dealer in Greenfield was a man named Mr. Patel, which was not a name she had expected, though she wasn't sure what name she had expected. He was perhaps 60 years old, with a jeweler's loop and the patience of someone who had been handling other people's valuables for long enough to have stopped being impressed by any of them. He examined each of the 41 coins in silence for approximately 7 minutes. Then he set the last one down. "Liberty gold pieces," he said. "Various denominations, various dates. The earlier issues are in better condition. The later ones show more handling." He looked at her. "I can offer 22,000. Wren did not flinch. She had not slept properly in 4 days, and she was doing the math, and the math required a moment. 22, she said. "They're worth more to a private collector, but I'm buying, not appraising." He looked at her over the loop. "If you'd prefer an independent appraisal, 22 is fine," she said. It was not fine. It was extraordinary. $22,000 was more money than she had ever had at one time, by a factor she didn't want to calculate out loud. She kept her voice level because Nora had kept her voice level when setting the price for a repair, and had told her once that the price you said out loud sounded different depending on whether you believed it when you said it. She believed it. Mr. Patel wrote a check. She walked to the bank in Turner's Falls, deposited it, opened a savings account, walked back out into the cold March light and stood on the sidewalk. She pressed her palm flat against the brick face of the bank building, the way she pressed her palm against a clock case when she needed to feel what was happening inside it, just to establish contact, just to confirm this was real. The wall was cold and solid. Real then. She had work to do. The first month was the clock, not the shop. The clock first, because the clock was why everything else was possible. She had slept on a folded army blanket from the storage cabinet, the first week rolled out on the plank floor beside the workbench with her messenger bag under her head and Nora's loop on the shelf above her. The second week she bought a folding cot from the Salvation Army in Greenfield for $12 and a wool blanket from the same rack for $8. She set the cot in the back of the shop beneath the rear window where the morning light came in first. A 2-burner propane stove, a pot, a mug, a used truck, a 2007 Chevy Colorado with 170,000 miles, and a heater that worked from a retired mail carrier in Montague for $2,100, a 50-pound bag of plaster repair compound, and a library card. The library card was for the Greenfield Public Library, which had a section on historic building repair that she checked out 3 books from and read by lantern light in the evenings while the master regulator ticked behind her. She learned to patch the plaster walls the way she had learned to repair clocks, by doing it wrong first, understanding the error, and doing it correctly the second time. The first patch cracked when it dried. She scraped it off, mixed the compound thinner. The second patch held. By the end of the 3rd week, she had worked her way around the front room section by section, pressing wet plaster into each crack and smoothing it and waiting for it to cure and sanding by hand until the wall was even. The pressed tin ceiling above it looked sharper against the clean walls, the stamped pattern visible for the first time in decades. She set Nora's photograph on the shelf above the workbench. Nora, at the bench in 1974, loop in her eye, a pocket watch open on the mat in front of her. She set the Fessenden watch, the Hamilton Railroad pocket watch that Mr. Aldrin had carried every day of his working life and given to Nora, and that Nora had wound every morning for 33 years on the workbench beside the master clock tools, wound and running, its tick a small quiet counterpoint to the deeper tick of the regulator on the back wall. She hung her coat on a hook beside the back door, set her boots beneath it, because a clockmaker's shop was a place where everything had a position and a purpose. Mrs. Auster came the following Saturday. She knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer, which Wren would come to understand was simply how Mrs. Auster operated in spaces she considered her responsibility. She carried a cardboard box, inside a coffee pot, a cast iron skillet, 2 plates, 2 mugs, a bag of groceries. "I am not," Mrs. Auster said, setting the box on the bench, "going to have Ezra, Hartwell's successor, starving in his own shop. He would haunt me." She looked at the patch walls, at the ticking clock, at Nora's photograph on the shelf. "Good," she said, "the way you said a word when it confirmed something you had been waiting to confirm." She came back the following Saturday with a small bookshelf her husband had been about to throw away. She came back every Saturday after that, always with something: a bag of apples, work gloves, a box of tea. She never stayed long. She sat on the bench inside the door and drank her tea and listened to the master clock ticking and said each time, "It sounds right." And every time it did. Word spread the way word spread in a valley of small towns, slowly, person to person, by name. The retired professor from Deerfield Academy, the same man whose carriage clock Wren had repaired at 12 years old at Nora's kitchen bench, drove to the shop one Saturday with a pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He handed it across the counter and said, "I've been waiting for you to get a shop." She repaired it that afternoon, he told his colleagues. A retired teacher in Deerfield brought a mantel clock her mother had left her, wrapped in a dish towel, carried in both arms like something fragile. A farmer from the next town brought a pocket watch in a leather case that smelled of machine oil. He said it had been in a drawer for 20 years, and he didn't have great hopes. She opened the case and listened before she touched it, the way Nora had taught her, and she told him what was wrong before she'd unscrewed a single plate. He looked at her with the expression people sometimes got, the expression of someone who'd expected less. A woman drove 40 minutes with a wall clock she said had not kept correct time since her husband died. Wren adjusted the escapement over the course of an afternoon, 1/4 turn at a time, listening after each adjustment until the tick was even on both sides. The woman collected the clock the following week and stood in the shop doorway holding it and listening to it, and then she said, "That's the sound my kitchen used to make." Each clock that came through the shop was an act of trust, a family handing Wren something irreplaceable and choosing to believe she understood what irreplaceable meant. She made that promise without words each time and kept it. Victor Kane arrived on a Wednesday in April. She heard his car before she heard him, large, new, the door shut with the sound of engineering that fit perfectly and cost accordingly. He was 55 years old and carried himself with the ease of a man for whom physical space had never been a negotiation. Good coat, good shoes for Mill Street's uneven sidewalk, the practiced smile of someone who used smiling as a professional instrument. He looked at the display window, unboarded and clean, now the master regulator visible from the street, ticking, and then he opened the door. "Miss Colby," he said, not a question. Yes, she did not put down the movement she was working on. Victor Kane. He looked around the room with the eyes of a man assessing a property rather than entering a shop. "You've done a great deal with the place." She waited. "I understand you purchased this building last month." "I did." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man preparing to explain something the other person was going to find unfortunate. "The thing is, Miss Colby, I purchased the lot adjacent to this building about 8 months ago, the parcel to the east." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "My surveyor finds that the northeast corner of this structure encroaches on my lot line by approximately 4 feet. Wren set down the movement. "Your surveyor," she said. "Professional survey, registered with the county." He offered the document. She didn't take it. "Has Mrs. Oster seen this?" Something shifted in his smile. "I haven't brought it to the clerk's office yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Woman to man." He looked at the master clock, then back at her. "It's not a significant encroachment, but it does create a legal complexity for you." She looked at him. He looked back, and then he said something that was meant to be incidental, a minor detail. He said, "I had someone assess the building a few months back, before you purchased it, just a condition assessment." He mentioned the back of the case on that clock. He nodded toward the master regulator. "Was showing rot behind the panel, which was part of why I hadn't moved more aggressively on the structure." He said it the way you said something you'd forgotten to mention earlier, and Wren heard it, the way she heard everything. Rot behind the panel. There was no rot behind the panel. The panel was sound mahogany. She had removed it with her own hands. She had examined every inch of it. He knew about the panel because he had opened it. He had been inside this building through a means she didn't yet understand, and had removed the original screws and reinstalled the panel with bright new ones. He had been in this room looking for something and had failed to find it because he had been looking with his eyes. She kept her face entirely still. 12 years of sitting across a workbench from clients who weren't always being honest about what was wrong with their clocks had given her a useful skill, the skill of receiving information without showing that you've received it, the skill of listening until you've heard everything there is to hear. "I see," she said. Kane's voice shifted, warmer, the voice of a reasonable man offering a reasonable solution. "Here's what I'm proposing. I'll give you $30,000. Cash settlement. You take the tools, the contents, everything you fixed up. I take the structure. The lot issue goes away. $30,000. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. 30,000 plus the 22,000 in the bank plus whatever she could earn. That was enough to start somewhere else. Rent a proper space, not fight whatever a developer with a registered survey and lawyers she couldn't afford could do to her in Massachusetts court. She was 20 years old. She had been second her whole life. And taking up less space than she needed was the thing she had been trained for since she was 6 years old, not by Nora, but by everyone else. Make yourself smaller. Need less. Don't inconvenience the people who were there before you. Take what's offered without asking about what wasn't offered. Be easy to accommodate. Be easy to remove. Kane was watching her do the math. She could see it on his face, the reading of her hesitation as the beginning of yes. She looked at the master regulator, at the pendulum swinging behind the glass, at Nora's photograph on the shelf above the bench. Nora, with her loop in her eye and her whole attention on the thing in front of her. The look of someone who was not making herself smaller for anyone. She thought about being 6 years old on a wooden stool, about pressing her ear against a wooden case and hearing something small and steady and exactly correct, about a sealed spring inside a sealed wall, inside a sealed building for 55 years, waiting for the right person, not a convenient person, not an easy person, the right one. No, she said. Miss Colby, no. Quieter the second time, which was not the same as softer. The property survey needs to go to Mrs. Oster. If you have a legitimate claim, the county process handles that. If you want to speak with me again, you can do it through the clerk's office. She met his eyes. I'm not taking your money. He looked at her for a long moment, the smile still technically present, but operating at a different level now. You may want to reconsider, he said. I've reconsidered, she said. I'm done. He left. The door closed. She stood in the center of the room and listened to her breathing until it steadied, which took slightly longer than she would have preferred. She picked up the movement she'd set down and found her hands not quite steady. Set it back down. She put both palms flat on the bench surface, the way she checked a surface, to feel what it was holding. Her palms were cold. The bench was solid. Okay, he'll come back with lawyers. Probably. And you don't have lawyers. And you don't have 37 years of shop income behind you. And you don't have... She stopped. She had a deed, stamped by Mrs. Oster, and the deed was good. She picked up the movement again. Her hands were steady. Sylvia Hartwell arrived 3 weeks later. She drove from Boston 2.5 hours, arriving at 10 in the morning, which meant she had left before 7:30, which meant this visit had been planned with some intention. She was 42 years old with dark hair, going silver at the temples, and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where people were paid to disagree with her and had found that the most effective response was usually to be better prepared than anyone else in the room. She carried a canvas bag that was heavy. She stood in the doorway and looked at the master regulator and listened to it tick for about 15 seconds without speaking. My grandfather's clock, she said, not a question. Your grandfather's clock, Wren agreed. Sylvia came in and sat on the visitor's bench near the door. She set the canvas bag on the floor between her feet. I'm Sylvia Hartwell. I know, Mrs. Oster called. Of course she did. Something close to a smile. I'm a lawyer, family law, not property, which is going to matter in about a minute. She looked at Wren directly. I heard you have a problem with Victor Kane. He says I have a problem with Victor Kane. He's been trying to acquire this lot for 3 years, approached the town 4 times. The town declined each time because the surplus process requires a willing buyer and the building has historic designation. She paused. He's also not known for patient legal channels. I'd look carefully at anything on or inside this building that looks newer than it should. Wren thought about 6 bright screws. She said nothing yet. I'm not here about the gold coins, Sylvia said. I know. You drove 2.5 hours on a weekday with a full bag. If you were here about property, you'd have called first and you'd have a briefcase. Sylvia looked at her. Fair, she said. She lifted the canvas bag onto the bench and opened it. Inside 12 cloth-covered journals, each labeled on the spine in the same small, precise handwriting as the letter from the hidden compartment, numbered 1 through 12, the earliest dated 1952, the latest 1969. My grandfather's work journals, Sylvia said. I've been going through them since my mother died last year, and I inherited his papers. She touched the spine of the 3rd volume. Your grandmother's name appears 23 times, beginning in 1961 when she started working for Mr. Aldrin. Wren's hands stilled on the bench. Aldrin and my grandfather corresponded for 30 years, by letter. I found 7 years of their letters in a storage box. Sylvia opened the 3rd journal and turned to a marked page. January 1962. He writes, Aldrin has found someone. A shop girl. He says 19 no training, but she can hear what the rest of us have to measure. He tested her with 3 watches, and she identified the slow one in 10 seconds. He says he'll train her himself. Her name is Nora. The clock ticked behind her. He writes about her again in 1966, Sylvia continued. Aldrin retired today. Sold the shop to the girl for $1. Nora, her name is. He says she'll be the last repair woman in Franklin County before long. She has the ear in a way that doesn't come along often, maybe once a generation. She looked up. My grandfather underlined that. Once a generation. Wren pressed both palms flat on the bench. One more entry, Sylvia said. She turned to the last journal, near the end. November 1969. He writes, closing the shop today. The battery clock has won. I cannot compete with a machine that never needs regulation, but I have made provision for the right person. Aldrin has told me about Nora's gift. If that gift is inheritable, and I believe it is, then whoever comes from her line will find what I have left. They will find it the way she would have found it, by listening first. Silence. Just the clock. He built that compartment for someone who could hear it, Wren said. He built it for Nora's descendant, Sylvia said. He just didn't know when that person would arrive. She closed the journal. I think you have a right to what he left. I think if he could see you standing there, he would agree. Then she said the thing that mattered. I'm also a lawyer, and I'm going to help you deal with Victor Kane, pro bono, because my grandfather built something that waited for the right person, and the right person showed up, and I'm not going to let a property developer take it. Wren looked at her for a moment. Why? She said, just needing to understand. Because I read 12 journals, Sylvia said, and I know who my grandfather was, and this is what he would have done. Wren stood with both palms on the bench, and the clock ticking, and the 12 journals on the seat beside her, and the particular unexpected weight of someone deciding to show up without being asked. Okay, she said. Okay, Sylvia agreed. The newspaper article ran on a Thursday, a small piece in the local paper. Young woman reopens historic Millhaven Clockmaker shop. Second section, a photograph of the exterior, a quote from Mrs. Oster about the building's history, a mention of the contents being found intact. It did not mention the gold coins, but the phrase historically significant contents apparently traveled in certain directions on its own. Diane arrived on a Saturday morning. The timing was after Mrs. Oster had come and had her tea and left. Wren was alone at the bench when the door opened, which she suspected was not accidental. The woman who came through the door was 42 years old and looked like what Wren might look like in 20 years. Dark hair, the same narrow jaw, the same stillness that Wren had always assumed came from Nora, but apparently came from somewhere else in the family line, from whatever this woman had passed on before disappearing. Diane, her mother, who had left Greenfield when Wren was 2, who had not come back. Wren set down the movement she was working on, carefully because it was a client's piece, and clients' pieces deserve care, regardless of what was happening in the air of the room. She covered it with the flannel cloth. Then she turned around. Wren, Diane said the name the way you said a word you had rehearsed, softly, like something she was testing the weight of. I saw the article. I know. I thought, a stop. You look like I thought you would. Wren said nothing. I know I don't have a right to be here. No, Wren said. You don't. Diane flinched. Small. She hit it quickly. I wanted to explain. It's been 18 years. She said it the way she said a diagnosis. Flat, accurate. You don't have to explain. People leave because they leave. You left. It was complicated. Wren looked at this woman, who had been an absent so long she had almost stopped being a person in Wren's imagination, who was now standing in the shop where the master regulator ticked and Nora's photograph watched from the shelf. She thought about something Nora had said once, not about clocks, about people, a clock that was running wrong and then stopped. Nora had said isn't fixed by winding it again. You have to find out why it stopped, and then you have to decide whether the work is worth doing. Wren had asked, what if you can't find out why? Nora had said then, that's your answer. Why now? Wren said. Diane looked at the floor, then at the clock, then back. I read the article. I've been thinking about you for... Why now? Wren said again. Not louder, not different, just again. And the repetition of it flat, precise. The same word twice to check the timing must have landed like what it was, because Diane said, I don't know, which was possibly the most honest thing she'd said. Wren looked at her for a moment. She thought about being 6 years old, on a wooden stool, the only place she was the right size, about 12 years of Saturday mornings, about sleeping on the plank floor of this shop in early March, with a borrowed blanket and the sound of the master regulator, and how it had been the first room she had ever fallen asleep in that sounded exactly the way a room should sound. She had learned in this shop what it felt like to occupy the exact amount of space she was meant to occupy. She was not going to make herself smaller, not for Victor Kane, not for this. I'm not going to close the door on you, Wren said, but I'm not going to open it either. Not right now. She said it the way she said prices, the way she said diagnoses, like someone who believed the words. If you want to be in contact, write to me here. I'll write back. But I'm not going to rush this because you showed up. Diane looked at her. She looked like someone who had expected less composure. Okay, Diane said. Okay, Wren said. Diane left. The door closed. Wren stood in the center of the room for a moment. The clock ticked. Morning light fell across the bench and the row of movements waiting for attention and the 12 journals Sylvia had left on the corner shelf. She had said no to someone who wanted money. She had said yes to someone who wanted to help. She had left a door unlocked without opening it for someone she wasn't sure about yet. She had done all of this without checking whether it was what the household wanted, without making herself smaller. She went back to the bench, picked up the movement, adjusted the regulation screw a quarter turn, listened, another quarter turn, the escapement balance, even on both sides, the sound of something that had been corrected and was now running as it was meant to run. Part 3. What the Silence Kept. Owen Marsh drove to the shop on a Tuesday morning in May, which was not the day he had planned to come, but was apparently the day he arrived. Wren had heard about him from 3 directions before she ever saw his face. Mrs. Oster first. There's a man in Deerfield who does antique movement restoration. He's heard about you. He's been very patient about not introducing himself, which I find encouraging. Then the retired professor. Owen Marsh knows your grandfather's work better than anyone living. Your grandmother's too, I believe." Then a woman who had brought in a Vienna regulator mentioned him in passing. The way you mention someone, you assume the other person already knew. He was 78 years old. He wore the look of a man who had spent his working life in small rooms doing intricate things, a quality of sustained attention in the face that came from decades of close focus of looking at things most people couldn't see. Gray hair cut close, the hands of a clock restorer, which were not the hands you'd expect, not fine, not delicate, but careful in a way that was different from fine. He set those hands on the counter when he came in and looked around the shop without hurrying. He looked at the master regulator for a long time. "I haven't heard it running in many years," he said. "How long?" "Since before the estate was settled, before the town took the property over." He looked at her. "I had a key once, the one Ezra gave me when I was his apprentice. I kept it for years after he died. Then Mrs. Oster asked me to return it." He looked at the clock again. "She said she was holding it for someone." "You were Ezra Hartwell's apprentice," Wren said. "His last one. I was 17 in 1981. He was in his early 50s, then retired from the shop, but still taking on private work, teaching privately. He took me on for 3 years. He moved to the bench and stood beside her, the way Nora used to stand beside her close, but not intruding, occupying the place where a teacher stood. He was a patient man, not warm in the way people usually mean, but patient in the way that mattered, patient with the work and patient with a person learning the work." He touched the frame of Nora's photograph with one fingertip. "I recognized her name when I heard you'd come. Nora Colby. I knew that name." "From the journals," Wren said. "Before the journals." His eyes met hers. "From a letter." The air in the shop changed, not dramatically, the way the air changed in a workroom when the thing you had been waiting to hear finally became audible, a shift in quality, the specific weight of an arrival. "He mentioned you'd be coming," Owen said carefully. "Eventually, after his death. He died before I was born." "He died thinking about it," Owen said, which was apparently enough. "He stayed for 2 hours that first Tuesday. He looked at every clock on her bench and described things about each movement she had not known. He showed her a more efficient grip for holding a balance wheel during regulation that eliminated the micro tremor that could throw the measurement off. He told her what a mainspring stored correctly for 55 years should feel like when reinstalled smooth with a certain resistance at the final quarter turn that told you the spring was taking weight properly. And she said it had felt exactly like that, and he nodded as if this confirmed something he had already expected to be confirmed. Before he left, he said he would come back Thursday. He said he might have something for her then. She didn't ask what. She had learned from 12 years of Saturday mornings with Nora that the right information arrived when the person carrying it was ready to deliver it. You didn't rush the clock. You let it tell you when it was ready to speak. The legal situation with Victor Kane was moving. Sylvia had filed a formal response to Kane's surveyor report attaching 3 sections of Ezra Hartwell's work journals dated entries from 1952 through 1969, referencing repair work done for clients on Mill Street records that established continuous occupancy and use of the property without any reference to a neighboring lot line at the location Kane's survey described. Mrs. Oster, meanwhile, had done something that Sylvia called, with genuine professional admiration, absolutely extraordinary. She had found in a file cabinet in a storage room at the back of the clerk's office a survey map of Mill Street dated 1947, filed by Ezra Hartwell's father when he built the shop. It showed the eastern property line of the Clockmaker's parcel at exactly the location the current building occupied. Kane's registered survey had used a benchmark that did not appear on any document predating it by more than 6 months. Sylvia called Wren with this information and said in the tone of someone delivering good news while maintaining professional restraint, he may have made a significant mistake. The county hearing was scheduled for mid-June. Wren kept repairing clocks, not because she could ignore what was coming, but because the bench was where she thought most clearly. The work occupied the same part of the mind that worry tried to occupy, and between the two, the work was stronger. It had always been stronger. Nora had known this and had never tried to fix it in Wren the way some people tried to fix qualities in others that were actually assets poorly understood. She had 3 movements that week from the same family: a grandmother's house being cleared, a daughter who had driven 40 minutes with a box of clocks and set them on the counter one by one and said, "My mother said these just needed someone who knew what to listen for." Wren had looked at each movement before opening any of them and told the daughter what she expected to find inside based on the sound quality of the tick. She had been correct on all 3. The daughter stood in the shop doorway and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "She told me the right person would know them without being introduced," which was not something Wren knew how to answer, so she just nodded and went back to the bench. Owen came on Thursday, as he had said he would. He sat on the visitor's bench near the door. He had a folder with him. "I want to show you something in the journals." Sylvia said she'd left them here. She brought the journals from the shelf. He opened the 10th volume, dated from the late 1950s, and found the section he'd marked. Ezra Hartwell had recorded everything: every repair job, every client, every part ordered and received, every bill paid. He had recorded the weather on days it affected humidity-sensitive work. He had recorded the price of benzene when it rose in 1963 and noted his opinion in a single terse sentence. He had recorded conversations, decisions, and occasionally something that was neither the observations of a careful mind working through a problem. And beginning in 1937, he had recorded something else entirely. "Read from here," Owen said. He pointed to a paragraph in the 10th journal. The entry was dated September 12, 1957. "A materials broker who has been operating in this region since 1934 has been found to have defrauded at least 11 independent craftsmen of their advance payments for raw materials. The total recovered through court proceedings was distributed to some claimants. I received a partial settlement of $340, representing perhaps 30 cents on the dollar of what was owed me. The other craftsmen received similar. Most of them have closed their shops. Aldrin tells me that 2 men he knew in the valley took the loss and did not recover from it. I intend to keep a record of what was taken. I intend to recover it if it can be recovered. I do not know how long this will take. I am 32 years old, and my father is still alive, and the shop is still running, and I have time, and what I do not have, I will make." Wren looked up. "Keep reading," Owen said. She turned to the 11th journal. He had marked the relevant pages. Over the next 20 years, in entries weeks and sometimes months apart, Hartwell had documented a patient and systematic recovery. Estate sales where the broker's assets had eventually surfaced, liquidated after the broker's death in 1951. Auction records, small settlements from business partners, items bought below value and resold. The money he recovered exceeded what he personally had been owed. He noted this explicitly more than once, and so it did not belong to him. It belonged in his accounting to the 11 craftsmen of the valley. Most of them were dead by the time he began recovering it. Their shops were long closed. He had converted the recovered funds slowly to gold, because gold did not devalue, because gold waited, because he did not know who the right person would eventually be. The last entry about the gold was in the 12th journal dated November 1969. The sum recovered over 35 years totals approximately what was stolen from the craft community of this valley between 1934 and 1942. I have not spent it. I have added to it when I could. It has been waiting in the shop for the person who will understand what it represents. This is not an inheritance. It is a stewardship. The money was stolen from makers. It should return to making. Ren closed the journal. She sat with the knowledge of this. Okay, the gold in that canvas pouch was not one man's savings. It was 35 years of careful private restitution. It was the recovered wealth of 11 craftsmen who were mostly dead, and whose shops were mostly gone, and whose trade had been dying since the battery clock arrived. It was money that had been stolen from makers. She had known something was different about the weight of it from the first moment she had lifted the pouch. She had not been able to name what she knew, but it had felt less like inheritance and more like a question. What are you going to do with this? She knew what she was going to do with it. She had known without knowing she knew since she was 6 years old on a wooden stool in Nora's kitchen, learning that some people could hear things other people couldn't, and that this was not magic, and that attention could be taught, and that the teaching of it was itself a form of love. She called Sylvia that evening. I need help setting up a foundation, she said. That's not family law, Sylvia said. No, Ren agreed. But you know people. A pause. Then, I know people. The county hearing on Kane's survey challenge ran for 4 hours in the 3rd week of June. Mrs. Oster presented the 1947 survey map in person. She did not sit when offered a chair. She stood and described the document, the way she described everything precisely without embellishment, with the composure of someone who had been keeping accurate records for 35 years and had very little patience for people who assumed such records didn't exist. Sylvia presented the journals, 12 volumes, dated entries from 1952 through 1969, repair orders, client addresses, supply, deliveries, the eastern lot line of the Hartwell parcel, referenced or implied, across dozens of entries, and in none of them consistent with Kane's survey. Kane's lawyer asked for a recess. They did not return from the recess with the energy they had entered with. The county board issued its finding 2 days later. Kane's survey was rejected. The 1947 map was entered into the official record. The encroachment claim was dismissed. Ren was adjusting the regulation screw on a Howard banjo clock when Sylvia called with the news. She held the phone with her shoulder. It's done, Sylvia said. Okay, Ren said. That's it, okay. I'm in the middle of a regulation. She finished it, set the clock on the shelf, listened to it tick. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the master clock case and let out a breath she had apparently been holding for approximately 2 months. Owen came the following Thursday. He came every Thursday now. He would work at the bench beside her for a few hours, showing her things she hadn't encountered yet, asking questions about what she'd taught herself, describing movements he had known across 40 years of restoration work. He had become, without announcement, the person who sat in the second chair at the bench, which was Ren had come to understand the only position that had ever mattered in a clockmaker's shop. Every teacher had sat in that chair beside someone. Every student had eventually moved from that chair to the first one and set the second chair out for the next person. The second chair was where knowledge moved from one generation to the next. It was always empty until the right person came. On this Thursday, Owen did not sit at the bench. He sat on the visitor's bench near the door. He had a folder with him, plain manila, worn at the corners in the way of something handled many times over many years. He set it beside him. I've been carrying these for a long time, he said. I wasn't certain when the right time was, but I believe it's now. He opened the folder. 2 letters, each in its envelope. Each envelope handled with the particular care of something that had been under your protection for years and was now being returned to where it belonged. Your grandmother wrote to Ezra Hartwell approximately 12 years ago, Owen said. He had been driving Ezra to appointments in his final years, the last regular contact Ezra had with the outside world. She found his address through Aldrin's old records. His address was still the shop address. I was collecting his mail by then. He set the first envelope on the bench. He read it twice. He went very quiet for a while. Then he wrote a response at the kitchen table in his apartment. He hadn't been to the shop in years by then. He gave the response to me to mail. He set the second envelope beside the first. He died 11 days later. Ren looked at the two envelopes. He said once near the end that the spring was wound and the pendulum was set. Owen said that the shop was ready, that it was a matter of waiting now. He said all it needed was someone to open the case and let it run. He stood up and got his jacket from the hook by the door where he always left it. I'll be back Thursday. He left. Ren sat with the two envelopes on the visitor's bench. The clock ticked behind her, even, unhurried, the sound of a movement that had been built to last and was doing what it had been built to do. The first envelope was postmarked Greenfield, Massachusetts. The return address was Nora's house on Elm Street. The handwriting on the outside was Nora's handwriting, not her repair notes, which she wrote fast and functional, her letters, which were different, careful, written with the good pen, the handwriting of a woman who understood that certain things deserved to be written as if you meant for them to last. Ren opened it. My name is Nora Colby. I believe you may have known my teacher, Mr. Aldrin. She read slowly. I don't know if you are still alive. I am writing to the address in Aldrin's files because it is the only address I have. If you are not alive, these words will not reach anyone who can use them, and that's all right. I am writing them regardless. I am 74 years old. I have arthritis in both hands, which has made the fine work impossible for some years now. I have been training my granddaughter at my kitchen bench on Saturday mornings since she was 6. She has the ear. I have never said this to anyone who was not Aldrin, but I believe it is true. She has it the way I had it at her age, and perhaps more strongly because she has had more instruction than I had, and less confidence than I had, which is a difficult combination, but not an impossible one. I am writing because I have been thinking about what will happen when I am gone. I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of leaving her without an anchor. She is in foster care. She has no family who will claim her after I'm gone, except in the abstract sense that some families claim people when they want something. She is 8 years old and very serious, and she hears things no one else in the room can hear, and she does not yet know what this means or what it is worth. I wanted to ask you something, not for money, not for intervention, just if you have anything left that belongs to the craft, anything that is waiting, anything that a person with the ear could use or learn from or be anchored by when there is no one left to anchor her. I have been teaching her to listen. I want someone to have left something for her to listen to. She doesn't know I am writing this. She probably won't know unless you have something to tell her, and unless she comes looking, and unless a great many things go right before any of that can happen. But I am writing it regardless, because that is what you do when you love someone, and you can see the future coming, and you want to put something good in its path before it arrives. Her name is Ren. She'll have my loop. You will know her by the way she listens. Nora Colby. Ren set the letter down. She pressed both palms flat on the bench, the way she pressed her palms to a clock case when she needed to feel what was happening inside it. Her palms were cold. The bench was solid. She breathed. In, out. Nora had written this when Ren was 8 years old, had found Ezra Hartwell's address in the files of a teacher who had been dead for years, had written a letter to a man she had never met, not knowing if he was alive to receive it, had sent it, had done this because that was what you did when you loved someone and could see the future coming and wanted to put something good in its path. Ren's throat did something complicated. She let it. She had learned from Nora that feelings that needed to be felt went worse the longer you held them back. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked up the second envelope, Hartwell's handwriting, the same small, precise script. Dear Mrs. Colby, I am alive. I am 83 years old and I am not well, but I am alive. I knew Aldrin. He was the finest listener I ever encountered in 60 years of this trade, with the exception of what he told me about you, which I have always believed. He spoke of you many times across our correspondence. He was proud of you in the way teachers are proud of students who surpass them, which is the rarest kind of pride and the hardest to sustain. The shop is on Mill Street in Millhaven. I locked it in 1969. I have left everything in it. The mainspring of the master regulator is behind the back panel. The compartment is sealed in the way you will understand when you read about it, because the way I sealed it is the only way someone with the ear would find it. I built it for someone with the ear. I built it for someone like her. Tell her if you are able to tell her, and if you are not, then I am writing this in hope that she will find it. Eventually, the way people with the right gifts find the things that were left for them. Tell her that the shop has been waiting a long time, and it is not impatient. The shop has been waiting because it knows that the right person takes the right amount of time. The spring is wound. The pendulum is set. All she has to do is start the clock. Ezra Hartwell. Wren sat in the Clockmaker shop for a long time. Outside, the Pioneer Valley went about its quiet business. A car passed on Mill Street. A door opened somewhere down the block. The maple tree outside the display window moved in a small wind she couldn't feel from inside. The master regulator ticked, steady, even, unhurried, the way it had been ticking since April, since the morning she wound the spring and set the pendulum swinging and said she would wind it and meant it. 55 years of silence followed by the sound of a movement built to last that had in fact lasted. She put both letters back in their envelopes. She set them side by side on the shelf above the workbench beside Nora's photograph and the Fessenden watch. 3 generations of careful attention, contained on a shelf 3 feet long. She picked up her phone and called Sylvia. I'm ready to talk about the foundation, she said. Sylvia said, I'll clear Thursday afternoon. The Hartwell Colby Foundation for Traditional Craft Apprenticeship was incorporated in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts 4 months later. Its purpose was to provide apprenticeship support for young people in foster care who showed aptitude in traditional crafts, clockmaking, woodworking, metalwork, textile work, and the repair and restoration of objects that carried other people's history. It offered stipends for the first year of an apprenticeship. It offered access to tools and materials, and it offered most essentially mentorship with working craftspeople who could teach through proximity and time and sustained attention what could not be taught from a book or a screen or a classroom. The knowledge that lived in the hands and the ears and the accumulated judgment of a person who had been doing a thing long enough to know it the way you know a language from the inside out. The gold coins, valued through independent appraisal and liquidated with care, constituted the founding endowment. It was not a large foundation. It was not going to change the world in the sweeping way of large institutions with large endowments and large staffs and annual galas. It was going to change it in the way that small things changed it. Person by person, Saturday by Saturday, one bench at a time, one pair of hands placed beside another pair of hands, and the older pair saying, here is what the material wants. Here is how you listen. Here is how you know when you've gotten it right. Mrs. Oster came to the incorporation filing as a witness. She signed in her precise hand and looked at the document for a moment before returning the pen. Hartwell Colby, she said. Hartwell first, Wren said. His idea came first. Mrs. Oster looked at the master clock visible through the shop window from where they stood in the clerk's office, at the pendulum swinging behind the glass, at the hands moving at their measured pace. He was not a sentimental man, she said. Hartwell, he was a precise man. He chose every word carefully and every action for a reason. She looked at Ren. He would have liked you. He built the compartment before I existed, Ren said. He liked me before he knew me. Mrs. Oster made a sound that lived in the family of laughter without being quite that. She held the door open. Ren walked through it into the October air. The valley in October had a beauty that was not soft. It was the beauty of clarity, gold and red against a sky that had stopped apologizing for being cold. The river low, the light sharp and shadowless. She had been here for 7 months. She had come with $10 and a canvas bag and a loop around her neck and a set of screwdrivers in their flannel wrap. She had a shop. She had a truck. She had a workbench that had outlasted 55 years of waiting and was now occupied every day. She had Owen coming Thursday and 3 clocks on the bench from a family in Shelburne Falls, and a grandfather clock arriving next week from a woman in Deerfield who had driven past the shop twice before stopping. She had a letter from a 14-year-old in a group home in Springfield who had heard about the foundation from her caseworker and who wanted to know whether the word apprenticeship meant what she thought it meant. It meant exactly what she thought it meant. Ren walked back to the shop on Mill Street and went in and closed the door behind her. The master regulator ticked. She sat on the wooden stool at the workbench. She picked up the movement she had been working on before she left, a small carriage clock, French circa 1890, with a mainspring cracked at the inner coil in the way of a spring that had been overwound by someone who hadn't known any better. The most common mainspring failure, the most preventable. She replaced the mainspring seating, the new barrel in the arbor, hooking the inner end to the winding post, engaging the click spring. She cleaned the gear train pivot by pivot with benzene and the horsehair brush from the 4th drawer. She adjusted the escapement 1/4 turn at a time, listening after each adjustment. She oiled the pivots, 2 drops, no more. She set the pendulum swinging. The movement engaged, the escapement ticked. The sound filled the small carriage clock case, the sound of something that had been broken and was now running correctly, even on both sides, unhurried, certain. She set the hands. She placed the clock on the shelf with the others. Above the workbench in the photograph from 1974, Nora sat with her loop in her eye and her full attention on the thing in front of her, the way she had always been, the way she would always be in this shop, which was her shop too now, which had always been her shop, built for her by a man who had known her only by reputation and by the quality of the ear she had passed to her granddaughter. Ren looked at the second chair at the bench, the one she had pulled up beside the workbench 3 months ago, the one Owen sat in on Thursdays, the one that had always been in every shop and every kitchen and every learning place she had ever known, the most important piece of furniture in the room. The second chair, not the second place. The second chair, the chair beside the bench where the person who knew things sat and where another person came and sat and where the knowledge traveled from one set of hands to the next. The chair that was empty until it wasn't. The chair you pulled up beside someone and stayed. Nora had given her the second chair, not as the person in it, but as the person who set it out, who had spent 12 years sitting beside a girl on a wooden stool and saying, "Listen, do you hear it? Listen harder. You have the ear. It's yours. It was always yours now. Listen." Ren was 20 years old. She had a shop. She had a clock to wind every morning. She had work that required her to be exactly who she was, not smaller, not larger, not second, exactly the size of her actual gift. She reached up and opened the glass front of the master regulator. She wound the mainspring 3 careful turns of the key no more, the way Hartwell had engineered it to need the way she had wound it every morning since April, when she had first set the pendulum swinging, and the shop had come back to life after 55 years of waiting. The pendulum swung, the gear train moved, the escapement ticked, the shop filled with the sound of a clock that had been built correctly and kept by the right hands, telling time the way time was supposed to be told, steady, even, unhurried, without apology. She closed the glass door. She sat back down at the bench. She put on the loop, and she listened.